Hello, everyone. My name is Danielle McConnell, and I am the Director of Community Engagement here at the Chicago Library. And on behalf of the University of Chicago Library, I am delighted to welcome you all to tonight's event, Freedom Seekers in the Underground Railroad in Northern Illinois, featuring historian and author Dr. Larry McClellan. We are honored to host this important discussion as a part of the Chicago in Focus series in recognition of Black History Month. I want to extend our sincere gratitude to Dr. McClellan for sharing his research and insights with us. A special thank you to the League of Women Voters of Chicago and all of our collaborators who helped bring this program to life. Your dedication to civic engagement and education, as well as the historical awareness, is invaluable. The University of Chicago Library is committed to fostering knowledge, research, and dialogue that connects the past to the present. Through our library engagement, community engagement initiatives, we work with schools, community organizations, and local leaders to provide access to resources, support educational programs, and create spaces for meaningful conversations like the one here tonight. From archival collections that document Chicago's history to programming that amplifies diverse voices, our goal is to make knowledge openly accessible to all. We hope this evening inspires you to further explore the rich history of freedom seekers in the Underground Railroad here in Illinois. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to this engaging discussion. And I'll pass it over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and we're really happy to be able to, partner on another one of our Chicago in Focuses here in the library and over Zoom. My name is Jane Ruby, and I am president of the League of Women Voters of Chicago. Thank you to everyone joining us here in person and also virtually. Just a little bit about the League before I introduce our speaker for tonight. The League of Women Voters of Chicago is a nonpartisan grassroots organization working to protect and expand voting rights and ensure everyone is represented in our democracy. We empower voters and defend democracy through advocacy and education. The League of Women Voters of Chicago encourages informed and active participation in government while influencing public policy. We never endorse or oppose political parties or candidates, but we are political. We do this in two different roles, through voter service and citizen education, and also through action and advocacy. And we've been around for over 100 years doing this work, and we're very proud to kind of continue the legacy with such public programs as our Chicago in Focus series. So definitely, if you're interested in learning more about the League or seeing any of the other videos from our Chicago in Focus series, there are flyers and QR codes at the table in the back. And now to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Larry McClellan. After graduate work at the University of Chicago, Dr. Larry McClellan helped create Governor's State University south of Chicago in 1970 and served with the university for 30 years. He is Emeritus Professor of Sociology and Community Studies. In the mid-70s, he was mayor of University Park, then called Park Forest South. He spent 4 years as a senior consultant with the Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission, and through his career served as pastor with diverse congregations. His consulting, research, and writing focus on freedom seekers and the Underground Railroad and on African American and regional history south of Chicago. Major publications include 25 articles in the Encyclopedia of Chicago, the Underground Railroad south of Chicago, co-author of To the River, The Remarkable Journey of Caroline Quarles, a freedom seeker on the Underground Railroad, Onward to Chicago, Freedom Seekers in the Underground Railroad in Northeastern Illinois, was published by Southern Illinois University Press in 2023. This received the National 2023 Memorial Prize for the Advancement of Knowledge from the Underground Railroad Free Press. In 2022, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Illinois State Historical Society for his contributions to Illinois history, and in 2024, they gave his latest book their award for superior achievement. Larry has spoken at 5 Illinois State History Conferences and 3 national conferences of the National Park Service Networked Freedom Program. He was principal researcher for listings on the NPS Network to Freedom National Register of Underground Railroad sites in Crete, Lockport, and Chicago. Some of his work can be found at illinoisundergroundrailroad.info. For 10 years, he wrote a monthly regional history column for the Southtown Star newspapers. Larry graduated from Occidental College in Los Angeles with a year at the University of Ghana in West Africa and additional studies in Great Britain and Jerusalem. He has served on the boards of the Illinois State Historical Society and the Will County Historical Society and has given lectures and programs across Illinois. Currently, he is president of the Little Calumet River Underground Railroad Project and serves on the Illinois Underground Railroad Task Force. And that is a lengthy and very worthy bio of someone who is so accomplished and knows a lot about this. And we are so thrilled to have him speak to us tonight on this subject. And so without further ado, I turn it over to our speaker.
Thank you. I think as we get started, I believe that my colleagues here have to figure out a way to make sure that that gets loaded as a screen share in Zoom. So can you two talk to each other and get that done? And I'll kind of start talking and hopefully they will have it put together. I'm delighted to be with you and all of those of you that are on the Zoom call. Over the years, as I worked in the suburbs south of Chicago, I had a lot of dealings with various chapters of the League of Women Voters, and really have always enjoyed that. And as probably all of you share, the League is one of those things that helps hold our democracy together, and we are in need of that. So thank you to all the League people for your very good work. So we started Governor State University in 1970. I was finishing an experimental doctoral program at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago. And about half of my work was in history and social science and half in religious studies. And I've always had kind of an academic hat and a religion hat. And it's been fun to kind of dance back and forth between those things. As we began Governor State 54 years ago, I immediately started making connection with African-American communities south of the city. There are the historic communities of Robbins and Fort Heights and historic Black neighborhoods in several communities, including Harvey and Chicago Heights.
Are saying that there will
be as I was connecting with folks,
response to this assault on national security, and they will continue to object to this legally through all available legal means, which could involve suing the Trump administration.
We are here in the room, we're getting someone else, but all right, we're back, they're gone. As I was connecting with these African-American communities, every once in a while, people started talking about the Underground Railroad. And I said, well, that's why, and probably for all of you, the Underground Railroad, that was Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and on the East Coast. And lo and behold, and over the last 20 years, I've been looking at this very seriously. And in point of fact, it appears that probably more people escaping their enslavement in the South came through Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois than ever went up the East Coast. And those are just forgotten stories. And part of what I'm sharing with you now are so we can be remembering those kinds of stories. Do you think we're set? Bingo. Okay, great. Then I can just hit that. Thank you very much. Thank you all. We're cooking. Okay, in talking about the Underground Railroad, there are really two great cycles of stories. There's a cycle of stories about the freedom seekers themselves, the people that were escaping from their enslavement, and there's a great cycle of stories about the Underground Railroad, the people that were assisting freedom seekers. Now, the dilemma we have is that for the last 150 years, last 180 years, almost all of the stories have been stories about the Underground Railroad and not stories about the freedom seekers. And that is the great dilemma, because what has happened in the 19th century, almost all of our history was written by old white guys. And when they talked about the Underground Railroad, it ended up being old white guys writing about old white guys. And that's a very, very limited history. And what we have to see, we have to really reimagine how it is that we're going to talk about the Underground Railroad. And that's what I'm sharing with you. And that's what a number of us are up to. Now, to reframe the stories, you notice, first of all, I talk about freedom seekers. Well, we're talking about the people traditionally referred to as fugitive slaves in the 19th century. The dilemma is that fugitive slave is a category of property. All right. When I do my research, I look for cattle, horses, pigs, sheep, and slaves. All right. Those of us across the country who work on this chose instead to refer to people escaping their enslavement as freedom seekers, because that is their fundamental human intention. And we want to affirm their human intention, not their category of property. Okay. So we have to reframe that language. So whenever you see fugitive slave, read freedom seeker. You know, this person is not simply property. This person is, in fact, a human being who is seeking to be a free human being. Okay, very much related to that, the mythology we have about the Underground Railroad is essentially, well, the Underground Railroad was established by all these good abolitionists, mostly white, all these good abolitionists, and the poor, helpless slaves came up into the Underground Railroad, and that's not the way it was. You have to reframe it because, in fact, the freedom seekers were the protagonists. And as they went into free areas and they asked for help, people responded. And as people responded, all those responders started to connect with each other. And that creates the network of the Underground Railroad in response to the journeys of freedom seekers. So we need to reframe that. And that, you know, this is not a system set up. It was a system that was set up in response to the movement of freedom seekers. Another thing we have to reframe is understanding the great diversity of the people that responded to freedom seekers. All over the free states, Black families and white families and individuals and in many cases, women acting on their own, families acting on their own. There was a great diversity in terms of the people that helped the freedom seekers. We need to break the old mythology about, well, it was Black freedom seekers and white abolitionists. That's just simply not the case. So I invite you to reframe that. Finally, I've already alluded to this. We need to reframe it to understand that this was something across the Midwest. It was not just an East Coast phenomenon. And very importantly, we need to reframe it so that the talk of the Underground Railroad is not simply about sites or locations, but it's about journeys. And so I invite you to join with me in looking this evening at how do we talk about freedom seekers and how do we talk about the networks of the Underground Railroad that responded to them. Sure.
Right here so that people on the screen can see, or is that going to drive you absolutely
Well,
crazy?
I'll try. I like to roam around, but
No, and you can roam around.
okay, I'll roam around a little bit. Okay, but they can see me here or somewhere. Okay. Hello, do you see me? Yeah. Aha, I'm there. Okay.
And
All right.
frankly, roam around, but just come home once in a while.
All right, that's a good idea. Okay, good. I can do that. Okay, fine. Okay, so as we're talking about these stories, we always got to remember, why is it that freedom seekers were escaping? And it was because of the brutal reality of slavery, of people being kidnapped, captured all across Africa, experiencing the horrendous journey across the Atlantic Ocean, and then being property. And I notice I've got this image up here of somebody being checked out. And it's very difficult for us to understand what it means for someone to be treated as property. We need to really grasp that what people were experiencing in the South, their enslavement was an awful thing. We always have to remember that. Now, where did people go? We often talk as, you know, a lot of people like to talk about, hey, God bless Harriet Tubman, but there are a lot of other people that did this stuff. And the blue arrows I've added to this map from 1850, and showing people going all kinds of directions. A significant number of folks escaped into Mexico, into the West to live with indigenous peoples, into the Caribbean. There were people that commandeered ships and took them up the East Coast to land in Massachusetts. Probably the majority of folks went north into the northern states. And on the map, the the free states are in red, and the slave states are in that blackish color. One of the reasons I like to use this map is to help you understand that this was really kind of complex. All right. Now, at the beginning of the Civil War, all of these states secede from the Union. However, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware do not secede. Abraham Lincoln is president of a country of free and slave states. All right. That's part of the reason why the legacy from Abraham Lincoln is so complex, is because he was always trying to figure out, how do we manage this? A lot of places across the country, were very important to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation at the beginning of 1863. Well, remember, Lincoln freed the slaves in the seceded states. He did not free the slaves in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. All right, it's a very complicated story. Now, another reason I like to use the map is because Cairo and the southern counties of Illinois are further south than most of the state of Virginia. Southern Illinois was truly southern. It was very much supportive of slave ownership. And part of the complexity in our state's history is because of that phenomenon of the South being, if you will, deeply South. Now, why is all this happening here? And just very quickly, a little short geography lesson. You may not be aware that we are sitting almost on a continental divide. All of the water to the east and the north of where we're sitting goes into the Atlantic Ocean through the St. Lawrence watershed. All of the water on the west and the south goes to the Mississippi River Valley. And so Chicago, and where we all live, was this great point of transition. And this has been the case for thousands of years. And certainly for the indigenous people that lived here, they established any number of highways. And again, people ended up in this region because it's the point of transition. Now, that's why freedom seekers end up in northeastern Illinois. My research suggests that 4,500, at least 4,500 freedom seekers came out of the South into Illinois, and probably in excess of 2,500 came right through the Chicago area. My focus has been both on Illinois and on Northwest Indiana, and there are essentially two streams of movement. As people were escaping from their enslavement, coming up into Illinois, the geography funnels them basically to the Chicago region. And as they come to the Chicago region, there's a large number that go directly to Chicago. Chicago was seen as a sanctuary city, as a place of refuge, and there were very, very good information systems in operation in the Mississippi River Valley. And people enslaved in Kentucky and Tennessee and Missouri and Arkansas knew about Chicago. I've got a wonderful little story about a fellow that escapes from Florence, Alabama, and he gets caught with a map to Chicago about 1825. And he was able to escape and got on his way. But there is this kind of large number of folks that coming to Chicago and through Chicago, or bypassing Chicago. Why? Maybe the directions they were receiving, they just headed straight toward Detroit and freedom in Canada. Maybe there was an overload of slave catchers in Chicago. There are any number of reasons, but a significant number of folks, instead of going to Chicago, they bypassed it and went straight east. And of course, they were going east to get to Detroit and then to freedom in Canada. The great irony was, if you wanted to be free, you had to leave the land of the free. After 1837, I think, Canada made no bones about the fact, if you step on Canadian soil, you are a free human being. And people understood that and knew that and headed for Canada. As I've done this research over the years, I've identified well over 60 places across northeastern Illinois where people found assistance coming up. And you can see kind of there is a kind of a flow of communities that head towards Chicago, and then there's another flow of communities that kind of comes across on the going directly east. Only a few of these have been fully researched. And any of you that are looking for a project, give me a call. I can use your help. There's lots and lots of work to do. Now, people coming into Chicago came up a variety of historic roads, and many followed the I&M Canal corridor. Others went east on the Sauk Trail corridor. Freedom seekers coming northeast out of the Illinois River Valley and making it to Joliet, to Wilmington, head northeast into Chicago. Many of them were following the corridor of the I&M Canal. Because of that great activity, we have gotten this is the headquarters for the I&M Canal, the most important public building in Northern Illinois in the late 1830s. That building still stands, and we have gotten that designated as a Network to Freedom site. They also have a cool little museum. If you ever want a day trip, go to Lockport and visit this cool museum. Now, the Network to Freedom program was established 26 years ago by the National Park Service. It is a program that connects all of us that are doing research on the Underground Railroad and are collecting freedom seeker stories. And there is a very rigorous process to have a site designated as an Underground Railroad site, a freedom seeker site. And I've done 3 of them. And let me assure you, it is really a bear to do those. If any of you have done a listing, an application for a National Historic Site, this is about twice as difficult. I mean, it's really a bear. However, part of what all of us are committed to is that we know the information and we dig and we're telling the truth. And there are over 700 places around the country and a couple in the Caribbean where people have identified places. We know freedom seekers were here, and all of that is linked together, which is very exciting for us. Now, people that came west came from the west into Chicago, came through some of the western suburbs. Not a lot of people, but some. This is the homestead of, it says Sheldon Peck. Of course, it should say Harriet and Sheldon Peck. But Sheldon and Harriet Peck, he was a painter, and he was one of the real activists in the western suburbs responding to freedom seekers. That site is on the Network to Freedom. Now, there are other people that came other ways, but the vast bulk of people came out of the Illinois River Valley up into Chicago. And when they got into Chicago, over time, a really remarkable set of folks began to respond to freedom seekers. Now, the traditional story that's in all of our history books is in 1839, the Underground Railroad started when Zabina Eastman, good, noble, white abolitionist, helped this poor, bedraggled slave get to Chicago and then get to freedom. And that's simply not the case. There have been Black families in Chicago since the early 1830s, and from the get-go, those families were responding to freedom seekers. By the late 1830s, it was well known in the Illinois River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley that Chicago was a place of refuge. And one of the key people in this, a fellow that was enslaved in Kentucky, gained his freedom, came to Chicago when he was 18 years old. And of course, you all know I'm talking about Louis Isbell, right? Here's a guy who is in the middle of every significant thing that happens in Chicago's Black community from 1838 to 1905, and you don't know him. Okay? That's why there's work to be done. So Louis is, he's enslaved. We think he was probably the son of his master, makes it to Illinois, comes to Chicago when he's 18, and he is in the thick of it for years and years and years. A really remarkable person. I think I've convinced the guy to write a book about Louis, but who knows? If you want to write the book, talk to me. A really, really remarkable person. Now, also in the late 1830s, a number of white families settled in Chicago, most of them from New York and New England. And among those are a group that over time begin to have some experience with the freedom seekers, and they begin to say this slavery stuff, we got to do something about this. And so by the late 1830s, there's a group of young white families who are responding and helping freedom seekers as they come in. Now, bear in mind that in Chicago and across the northern states, a lot of people were anti-slavery. Let's say in the 1850s, maybe a bit more than a majority were anti-slavery. A small number of those folks said, this is so bad, we have to act against it. They wanted to abolish slavery, end it. And they became the abolitionists. And within the abolitionists, there was a tiny number of families that said, this is so serious, we will break the law to help people. So this remarkable group of young white families decide they organize themselves, are breaking the law, and they're helping freedom seekers that come into Chicago. In the mid-1840s, a remarkable collection of young Black families settled in Chicago, and they immediately get involved with the Black families that have been there forever in assisting freedom seekers. And very quickly, these young Black families become the leaders of the Underground Railroad activities in Chicago. And it's a really a remarkable group of folks. Some of you may be familiar with the stories of John and Mary Richardson Jones. John was the first elected official in Chicago and Cook County, elected to the county board in the 1870s. They were very wealthy. There were this kind of collection of young Black families. And what is remarkable is that after the horrendous Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, these young white families, they're not so young anymore, these young white families and these young Black families start connecting with each other and end up working together closely. And we end up finding friendships that reach across that chasm of race. And oh, we lost the screen. All right. I'm glad I have these folks taking care of me. So while they're doing that, in many ways, this is the first great civil rights movement in Chicago, in Illinois. Black families and white families working together to assist freedom seekers. And it's very interesting. And let me just do with this what you want. What the abolitionists did and the Underground Railroad people said, there is a natural law, and we will follow that natural law. And what the government does is one thing, but some of what the government does is immoral. And we will counter that because we're following a natural law that people ought to take care of each other and be kind and have compassion and welcome people. And so they were willing to break the law because the Fugitive Slave Act was set up to work against all that stuff. So there were other families, including the Atkinsons and the Abrams and others. And what happens is that as this develops in the 1850s, there are really two great sources of energy in the two historic Black congregations. These are their current buildings. Quinn Chapel, AME, started as a prayer group in the mid-1840s and became a real hub for activity responding to freedom seekers. And then a Baptist congregation starts in the early 1850s as Zoar Baptist Church, and that becomes Olivet Baptist Church. Some of you may know Olivet. In the 1930s, Olivet was the largest Protestant congregation in the world. It has a really glorious history, which reaches all the way back to these freedom seeker times. So that's just a kind of an overview. And Deer League people, or Regenstein people, if you want me to come back sometime and tell you just Chicago stories, we got a raft of just great Chicago stories, starting with my buddy Louis Isbell. But the stories of what goes on in Chicago are really astonishing. But I'm trying to give you this broad stroke at this point. Okay, so now we know that people were coming into Chicago on those old historic roads, and then south of Chicago, in the late 1840s, two Dutch immigrant communities got established, what we know as Roseland and South Holland. And they become very important because they are located on the historic road to Detroit. And so what happens is that remember, Chicago was this little town up at the north of the map, and it was 15 miles of open country to get down to the Roseland. And they had to cross the bridge over the Little Calumet River so that they could go down around the bottom of the lake and head on their way to Detroit and then Canada. So these two Dutch communities were right in the way. And as happens, if people needed a little bit of assistance, they stopped and asked a farmer, and all the Dutch people spoke Dutch, except there were two families, the Kuipers and the Tons, who spoke English. And so they kind of become the leaders of the Dutch communities because they can communicate to other people. So the Kuiper farm is right in Roseland on the historic road, and the Ton farm is on the Little Calumet River, just a couple blocks from the historic road. So as people were coming through, they were getting assistance from the Kuipers. It was Cornelius and his wife, Marte Kuiper, and Jan and Angie Ton. That's a picture of Jan and Angie. I can never say her name correctly. I'm not Dutch. They established a home right on the Little Calumet River in 1853, and the Kuipers and the Tons were directly involved in responding to freedom seekers. We've got a great cycle of stories about the Kuipers, particularly Cornelius Kuiper, kind of befuddling some slave catchers. That is a site on the National Underground Railroad, the National Network to Freedom, and we have done a good deal of work. And with me this evening is my colleague Tom Shepard, and Tom is the volunteer coordinator for all of our activity. Wave your hand, Tom. That's Tom. Tom and I have been working on this together for quite a number of years. About 2 years ago, we were able to get a few grant funds to establish a state historic marker. And if I had my clicker, I would point to, but just from going from the left, it was wonderful. I had 150 people. That's Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton. Next to her is Ron Gaines, who owns the marina where this is located. On the other side is Congresswoman Robin Kelly, County Commissioner Donna Miller, and there's Tom on the right. The fellow in the black and the glasses was the Consul General for the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Chicago. And the Dutch are really excited that we've been doing this work on Dutch immigrants that were involved with the Underground Railroad. So much so that this past spring, the ambassador from the Netherlands to the United States visited with us, and they are helping us to put up some signs that are in English and Dutch. And we thought that was kind of a neat thing. So we've done a lot of our work there, and we've been working with groups all over the place, and we've worked with a number of groups that are involved in that first stream of movement, people going to Chicago and then down around the bottom of the lake. And then we've also been working with people that have taken that second stream. And that is the Sauk Trail Corridor, a Native American corridor for hundreds of years. The Sauk Trail went from the historic native cities along the Mississippi over to Detroit, and it was that way that they moved back and forth on that, communicating with other tribal peoples, and that's also how they got to the French and the British and the European traders. Now, along that Sauk Trail, going through the very southern part of Cook County and Will County, is the Sauk Trail, and you'll notice with my arrows that we've identified a number of places where people found assistance as the freedom seekers were traveling across. Some of you may know the Sauk Trail, and it's right, it's right there. And when I talk to the school kids about it, they get real excited because they know the Sauk Trail. All of what I'm talking about happened right in our backyards. Okay, now just south of the Sauk Trail, the community of Crete, the Crete Congregational Church, was established in 1839. This building still standing, built in 1853. In 1841, this congregation was one of the first churches in Illinois to issue a statement condemning slavery. And it turns out that a large number, probably several hundred freedom seekers, found their way through Crete on their way to Detroit. And they found assistance from a remarkable group of young activist families who decided they would break the law and help those that were escaping. This site is also on the Network to Freedom. Now, as we've been looking at this, I've done a lot of work figuring out how did people come up through Illinois. And it was alluded to earlier, during the last year, I had the delightful honor of being one of the members of a state mandated task force on the Underground Railroad. And we have created a set of recommendations for the state legislature to establish a permanent Illinois Freedom Trails Commission to help us study and pull together all our information about freedom seeker journeys and these Underground Railroad sites. And so we've done a lot of that work. We know an awful lot about what happened around Chicago, but where did folks go? We say in general, they went on to Detroit and freedom in Canada, but exactly where did they go? And so I started to look at various things. First of all, of course, we've got the Sauk Trail, and freedom seekers came up and they used that corridor. Then in 1825, the federal government decided they would establish a military road from Detroit to Chicago. And that becomes a very well-traveled highway for people moving. And then in the early 1830s, the Michigan Territory establishes the territorial road going across. And recognize these roads are kind of meant to go west. We're opening up the west. And here we are, freedom seekers, reversing travel so that they can get east and get to freedom in Canada. There were all kinds of connecting roads. I've just put major roads on here. And so what we are looking at is how can we establish a national historic trail that would follow some of these old routes so people can literally follow in the footsteps of freedom seekers. We are trying to connect the dots. Now, every one of those arrows represents a place where we've got very good evidence about freedom seeker activity. And so what we are proposing with this National Historic Trail is going to pull together access to a lot of those places. And we're just really excited about that. How do we commemorate the journeys of freedom seekers and commemorate the networks of the Underground Railroad? This is going to take us probably another 6 years for it to become a National Historic Trail recognized by the National Park Service. Every one of those arrows represents a research opportunity. So if you would like to dig into something, let me know. Now, freedom seeker stories are really journey stories, always. People escaping their enslavement. And I have got 6 or 8 lines up there. I could put, a couple dozen lines very easily. But what I want to do is end with 2 stories. First of all, Caroline Quarles. In many ways, this is the compelling Midwest story. Caroline was enslaved in St. Louis. She was the daughter of her master's son. And at one point in his life, the master's son decided it was party time, and he raped some of the slave women. And there was a young girl named Maria, 17 years old, and the consequence was Caroline. This is the only picture we have of Caroline. She grew up in that household, an enslaved person, pale skin, freckles, blue eyes, long black hair, and she was enslaved. And in the house growing up with her were her cousins who were free. At age 16, 1843, Caroline has enough. She is ready to find her freedom. And among other things, we don't know this exactly, but I'm pretty sure that part of what Caroline understood was that as a beautiful young woman of 16, if she were kidnapped, she would be sold into New Orleans, and she would spend her life in a fancy house. And I believe Caroline chose to find her freedom and also to avoid that that life. So Caroline, remarkable story, because she can pass for white, she goes down to the dock and buys a ticket north on a riverboat and starts this astonishing saga where she goes up the Mississippi all the way to Galena. She gets to Galena, she gets off the riverboat. There's one black guy living in Galena, and he says, "You're Caroline, you're in deep trouble. The slave catchers are after you," because word had already gotten up to Galena. There was an $800 bounty on her head, and this black guy saw that she was passing and said, "We got to get you out." Puts her on the first stage out of town, which ends up going to Milwaukee. She's the first black person that shows up in Milwaukee, and the white abolitionists are not sure what to do. She's there for 3 weeks, and then they send her with an escort. They send her down around Chicago to get all the way to Canada and to freedom. Okay, and as she comes down and around, Caroline travels down through Elgin and down to Naperville and Lockport and New Lenox and over through Crete. Remember the Crete Church? Those folks, they hosted Caroline for a couple of days. We've got some wonderful stories about what happened. But she then passes through Northwest Indiana, and one of the real kind of joys of our travel life for my wife Lil and I is that we became very close, dear friends with some of Caroline's descendants in Canada. And we've got some just wonderful stories. And I ended up doing a little book with one of her descendants. We've got it here today. It's called To the River, The Journey of Caroline Quarles. Small commercial. I have here To the River, The Story of Caroline Quarles, and a book called The Underground Railroad South of Chicago. The big book, Onward to Chicago, wonderfully, the Seminary Bookstore has copies of that for sale in the back. So please buy them. You're helping the cause. And if they run out, we've got copies to sell. Okay. End of footnote. Okay. So Caroline goes on this absolutely remarkable saga, 16 years old, 1,200 miles. Now, Caroline Quarles, her white family were the Quarles. They had moved to St. Louis from Virginia, and they had known, the Madisons and the Jeffersons and all of that. Caroline's white great-grandfather and white great-uncle were with George Washington at Valley Forge. Right? Needless to say, this prominent family in St. Louis let people know about their revolutionary heritage, okay? And Caroline is really bright young woman, understands what's going on. And so when she declares her independence, she leaves St. Louis on the 4th of July. Just wonderful. Okay, now, the second story has to do with John and Eliza Little. John and Eliza were enslaved in Western Tennessee and on adjoining farms. John had come from Virginia. He was a fairly strong fellow. He carried the marks of his enslavement on his back all of his life. John and Eliza ran into each other and fell in love and got married, but they were enslaved on adjoining farms. And they realized after they got married, if they were going to have any life together, they had to leave. They had to leave their enslavement and find their way to freedom. And so in the spring of 1841, John and Eliza met secretly at night, and they headed for freedom. And they knew that there's a kind of unique geographic thing. The Tennessee River is one of the few rivers in America that flows directly north. You think about it, all of our rivers flow more or less south. Well, the Tennessee comes across Tennessee and then it flows north for about 200 miles. And so they realized that they could get to the Tennessee River and go downriver up north. Got it? All right. Downriver up north, and they got it. So they're following the Tennessee River, and they get close to the Ohio River, and there's a swamp. And years later, John remembered and told some folks about this. And he said, we got to that swamp and I found a log that was floating, and I put Eliza on the log, and all that we had with us, I put on the log behind her. And I knew that if I misstepped pushing that log, I would lose everything I loved. But John didn't misstep. And they got through that swamp. They got to the Ohio River and they borrowed a boat to get across the Ohio. And they're on the north side of the Ohio River, exhausted. And they start a little fire, a little campfire. And just by accident, some other freedom seekers had crossed the river and they saw the fire and came and sat with them. And these folks were really discouraged. And one of them said, you know, the Cairo is just a few miles away. If we go back to Cairo and turn ourselves in and go back to our master, maybe he'll, maybe he won't be too harsh and we'll turn ourselves in. And Eliza Little stood up at that campfire and she looked at them and she said, I know where we have been and I know where we must go. And if needs be, I will walk barefoot to Chicago for my freedom. And Carolyn and John Little walked 370 miles to get to Chicago. Then they got a boat, went on to had a really good life after that. But can you imagine? Caroline, 1,200 miles. John and Eliza. In Illinois, 370 miles. Then you add the 200 out of Tennessee, and you added the stuff going on to Chicago, on to Detroit. People enslaved were determined to be free human beings. And we've got loads of stories. And what we need to be doing collectively, and if you'd like to help, you're welcome, is to help find and tell those great stories of freedom seekers, find and tell the great stories of the people that respond to them so that we can enlarge this understanding of our remarkable history. Thank you. Might be some questions. You want to maybe we'll get through the chat also. Any questions? Yes.
How did he gain his freedom? Was he manumitted or?
No. Like I said, we're pretty sure that he was that Lewis. The question was, how did Lewis Isbell get his freedom? As I indicated, we're pretty confident that he was his master's son. The family, the White family, moved to Southern Illinois with their slaves when Lewis was about 11 years old. And after moving to Illinois, they just had a handful of slaves. They decided to give their slaves their freedom. And I think, we haven't been able to do the deep research yet, but I think because of the family entanglements. I mean, if Lewis is the owner's son and he might have had some kind of ongoing relationship with Lewis, we don't know. But we do know that at 11 years old, he's given his freedom by his owner. And he continues to work on the farm. And then at age 18, comes to Chicago.
And I'm going to have everyone ask their questions in the microphone so everyone on Zoom can hear.
Yes, up front.
So I understand that in the Northeast, in some of the cities, including Philadelphia and Boston, there was, I guess, enough interest in assisting freedom seekers that there was a lot, and there was a lot of openness about it. There were speeches and newspaper articles and that sort of thing. Was there ever anything like that in the Midwest?
Well, absolutely. I refer to it as an open secret. And there was a great deal of activity. A great deal was reported by the Tribune and the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Democrat, and other papers. It was very much of an open secret. And there's some people here that I know were around in the 60s. Okay. Now, if you remember, of course, I'm talking about marijuana. Of course, none of you smoked. I understand that. But if you remember, in the 60s, everybody knew somebody that knew how to get some grass, right? Do you remember that? Well, the Underground Railroad was very much like that. I'm not going to be involved at all. But the Dyers down there, or the Jones over there. And so it was very much of this kind of shared open secret. Also, one of the things that we don't talk about an awful lot is that, particularly within the Black community, people were holstered up. There was no hesitation. If freedom seekers came and started to capture someone, all of a sudden they might be surrounded by a dozen Black guys with guns. And that has a way of getting people to back off. And that's part of the remarkable story, is that the Black community was extraordinarily well organized to respond, and also, when need be, to protect. And we've got some glorious stories of slave catchers that all of a sudden realized that the wise thing for their life was to just leave Chicago. So it was people were very much aware of it. Yeah. Any other things?
Got one here.
One here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Someone asked, it's interesting there aren't paths heading directly north to Canada through Wisconsin, Upper Peninsula. Was that part of Canada not as well known? Actually, there are two questions here, but that's
well,
the
okay.
same
Let me
question.
start with that. Why? What about movement up through Wisconsin?
Yeah.
In fact, we know of a handful of freedom seekers that did go up into Wisconsin, but recognized in the 1840s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, that was, from America's perspective, that was wilderness. There were native peoples up there, but there weren't roads, there weren't settlements, there was nothing up there. And so you would be going north into the wilderness. And there were folks that went up out of Chicago to Milwaukee and Racine to get on the boats, because the slave catchers were so prominent at the wharves in Chicago that the boats would leave. The boats that regularly took freedom seekers, the boats would leave. They'd stop at Racine and Milwaukee, and people would then get on the boat. But in terms of going up into the state, it just it was undeveloped from the American perspective. The second question?
Oh, I was going to ask a question.
Okay.
Actually, prompting, you were teasing us with saying, I have wonderful Chicago stories. And I just wondering, could you give us one that's located in the city of Chicago? Anything over in Bronzeville, or anything that is in our little neighborhood around here?
There is an immediate story that comes to mind. Louis Isbell was approached by the white sheriff, and said, those three guys that you're taking care of? Well, there's some slave catchers that are after them. And they said they're going to come talk to you, Louis, about those guys. And Louis says, fine. The guys come to Louis and say, we're looking for these three guys. And they describe these three escaped guys. And Louis says, I know about them. Now, what the slave catchers didn't know was that Louis had the three guys in a cabin just outside Chicago. And Louis says, you know what, guy? I can, for a little bit of money, I'll take you to seize the three guys. And the slave catchers can't believe their luck. My God, we got a black guy here that's going to help us get our fugitives. So Isbell says, come join me tomorrow morning, like around 10 o'clock or something, and I'll tell you where they are. And so, the slave catchers go and probably have a good night's drink and dinner and so on. In the morning, they get in. However, they don't know that Louis has gone to about a dozen of his buddies and said, okay, we've got a problem. There are three fugitives at the little cabin outside, and we need to protect them. And so I'm going to send these slave catchers out there, and I want you to beat them out of them. Don't kill them, but beat them up so they will not come back to Chicago. And so this group of 8 or 10 guys go out to the cabin with their guns and their bats. And the slave catchers come to Lewis, and Lewis says, "Oh yeah, yeah," and they give him a little bit of money. We don't know exactly, probably $100 or something, which was a lot of money then. And so the slave catchers go out to the cabin, and they get out there, and of course the guys jump out of the woods, they beat the crap out of them, and they realize trying to capture people in Chicago was not a good idea. And that's, there are a lot, lots and lots of stories, but I love that story. Other questions? Yes.
Hi. I was wondering, the responders
Yeah.
that were helping the freedom seekers, what dangers did they actually face being prosecuted by the law, since some of them were, breaking the law?
Oh, great question.
And also, was everybody, on board with their neighbors who were breaking the law and helping with? Everybody was like just okay with that? Nobody was going to turn somebody else in?
There was always the danger being turned in. And that's why I like using the marijuana example, because in the 60s, there were a whole lot of people that would never touch that stuff. And, we're totally outside of that. And it was like that with the response to enslaved people. There were a whole lot of people that had nothing to do with it at all, but some did. And in the 1840s, the 1830s and 40s, it was illegal to help fugitives, but not a big deal. And in Chicago, in a sense, people didn't care. No scam. However, everything changes in 1850 with the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act was a set of actions that the federal government took in 1850, basically trying to hold the Union together. And the Fugitive Slave Act was this awful, probably the most egregious piece of federal legislation in American history, was the Fugitive Slave Act. And among other things, it said that anybody that assists a freedom seeker could be fined up to $1,000 and spend a year in jail. Okay, remember, in 1850, $1,000 is like about $20,000. Okay, so it was very dangerous. There were a handful of people in Illinois that did get prosecuted under that law, but basically, it was once again a thing that we just had to be really careful because of this crazy law. But the consequences could be very serious. Along the Mississippi River, there were several Underground Railroad folks that in fact got captured by Missouri law enforcement people and were put in jail, in prison in Missouri. But in Illinois, basically, you need to be very careful. But the stakes for people helping freedom seekers really went up after 1850. And that's one of the reasons why the Black community established vigilance committees, because they knew it was now very, very serious. And let me when they set up the law, they said, okay, if you are a court official or a sheriff, and somebody brings a Black person to you and says they're a slave, you evaluate the situation, and the federal government's going to give you some money for your administrative costs. Now, you will have the choice. You can evaluate the evidence and say, no, that Black person is a free person of color. They just go on their way. Or that person is an enslaved person and they go back south. Okay, now you report that. And if you report, I evaluated this freedom seeker or this Black person and said he was not a slave, that you will get an administrative fee of $5. Okay, in 1850, $5 is, what, $100, $75. However, if you evaluate the evidence and say that that person is enslaved and ought to be taken back, the federal government's going to give you an administrative fee of $10. Hey, see that? And how many people sitting in courthouses all over this country looked at some Black person they didn't know and said, sure, I'll screw their life because I'm going to get twice as much money. That's how bad the laws and stuff are. Okay, maybe how are we on time? We're doing okay?
We're doing great. We're really doing
Oh,
great.
good.
Yeah. Here's a question I know you'll want to answer. And it is, What does the research assistant or you request involve, assistance involve, and how do we get started? You like that question?
Oh, yeah, I like that question. That's my book. The work that Tom and I are doing, or you can see it at undergroundrailroadproject.org. If you go to illinoisundergroundrailroad.info, you can get a lot of information on the stuff that I've been doing. And to the person that made the wonderful request, there is my email address. Send me a note. I have a kind of a research protocol that I've worked out for every site, and you can do as little or as much of that as you want to. And it could involve all kinds of things. It could be census research, it could be property research, it could be taking pictures. So it really depends on the kind of time that someone has and where they're located. But we have well over 30 sites from Chicago all the way to Detroit where we need some help. And there are other sites. There are more than 20 sites in the city of Chicago, and I would dearly love to have people start pulling this stuff together. There's a lot of stuff to pull together. So if you want to be a researcher, be in touch. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm from Detroit, and in Detroit, there are a network of churches that
Right.
have the Underground Railroad memorials as well as museums, and people can come and view and take tours. Are there any churches in Chicago or in the Chicagoland area that have ongoing tours of the Underground Railroad at all?
First of all, Detroit has done a wonderful job on really identifying and pulling together a lot of their information about the journeys of freedom seekers and the Underground Railroad sites. We know a great deal about Chicago, and we are, on the one hand, just beginning to put it together. We do a lot of work with the folks at Quinn Chapel, and they are going to be established. They're in the midst of a giant multi-million-dollar renovation. They're going to be establishing an Underground Railroad museum in their basement. And we have designated in our work, we've designated Quinn Chapel as the starting point for the National Historic Trail, the Chicago to Detroit Freedom Trail. At the Little Calumet River, my colleague Tom and I do a series of tours for the Forest Preserve of Cook County. We also do a number of private tours, and we get this kind of little grant from the Forest Preserves to do this. And we're very open to talking about that. So, you can check our website about those tours. We are also beginning to work with just in the past year, they established the Bronzeville Black Metropolis National Heritage Area. The National Park Service created that heritage area. We work very closely with Bernard Turner, who's the executive director, and we've already had 3 or 4 tours where we've done the Little Calumet River and then gone up to do stuff at Bronzeville. And we hope to keep building on those tours. And another thing, another small advertisement, both I think up here, but also on the table in the back, for those of you that live in the south suburbs or the south end of Chicago. We've been at this as a group of volunteers for about 6 years. And on February 21st, Friday, February 21st, we're going to have a celebration. And we got a bunch of people going to have some singing, and we hope we're going to have a drumming group and, spirituals, and we're going to tell a few stories. It's going to be a really neat event. Free, but you can make contributions, of course, but free. But if those of you that live in the South region, do pick up one of those flyers and join us, okay? They're on the table right there. Okay.
And someone wanted to know how to get your book on Caroline. And I gave her bibliographic information.
Right.
But if you wanted to address somebody online,
somebody online. Okay, they send me an email. The easiest way is send me an email, and I'll get right back to you about the book. They are available through eBay, but that costs a lot and all that kind of stuff. For those of you that are here, those are the 2 more specialized books that we have up at the front table. To the River, $18. Underground Railroad South of Chicago, $22 American. Okay, so we've got to sell those to you. And remember, the Onward to Chicago are in the back. Okay, any other? I would be happy to sign the books. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, well, we're in a an ongoing process, and if any of you are with us online or are here, if this is intriguing to you, we'd love to have your help. We've got a remarkably diverse group of folks that are working with us, and I think this is important stuff. Black history matters because it is part of history for all of us. And as you see, the reframing of these Underground Railroad stories and reframing the freedom seeker stories is a way to really pull this into, and it has to be pulled into, the rich history of this country. And I'm just delighted that we can be a part of that. And if any of you would like to be a part of it, come join us. So.
And I'm sorry, but Kwame here has had his hand up the whole time, and the audio has been crazy, and he needs to ask me in person. So I am going to mute, and I'm going to open it up. And it's going to be noisy and ugly, but we're going to let him go.
Okay, great. Okay.
Go for it, Kwame. Give us your question.
Sure. First, can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely, perfectly.
Okay, great. I'll just say, Larry, what you did is so important. What I'm learning, first of all, I want to say I learned about this subject through Glennette Tilly Turner's book. I never met her, but I see she's on the call. And I think it's important to acknowledge that she was recording and reporting this decades ago.
That's right. Glennette is on the call. She's
Yeah.
a dear friend and been a mentor for many years, and we have collaborated on all kinds of stuff.
Yep.
Go ahead, Carl.
She inspired me to learn this to the point where I tried to walk the paths. And at one point, a police officer came out with a club. Someone had called and reported me to confront me. And I really got the feeling of what it was like to experience that. The Chicago Defender and Quinn Chapel have kept this story alive. But what's so important about what you're doing, Larry, is that as African Americans, we're not totally free or equal yet. In 2025, no Black person could probably get the audience that you will get. So I appreciate you using your privilege as a man and as a white man to get this subject out, because other Black researchers have written books, called meetings. Glennette has done so much, and it's just not going to happen. But I appreciate you doing that. I hope you will acknowledge those people who came before you. There are a lot of other good stories. And I'll just stop there. But I do point people to Glennette's book, The Underground Railroad in Illinois. I think it was published in 2001. And again, I think you would be you would create a great example for other whites to learn to acknowledge and advance the research that has been done by African Americans. Thanks.
Thank you, Kwame. And I very much affirm what you're talking about. And I think that it's true for, anybody that's involved in history, is that we build on the work of others. And that my great good fortune has been that over the years, I've worked with a wide variety of African American scholars and white scholars, and we very much are in this together. But I think it is very important, as you're saying, to affirm that for many, many years, when the rest of us were not paying attention, there were people like Glennette Turner and other colleagues, now colleagues across the country, people of color who were doing this work. And I'm glad to join them in that and to build on their work, and appreciate what you said. Any other questions? I think we're on. Are we done? Okay, thank you.